American forces conducted 8 freedom of navigation operations in disputed waters in 2019, 3 more than in the previous year. Beijing says its Air Force and Navy held a joint exercise in the South China Sea on March 10 to simulate face-to-face encounters with invading aircraft and warships. The United States intensified its military activity in the South China Sea last year, raising the risk of a confrontation with China in the strategically important waters, according to a Beijing-based think tank. The U.S. conducted 8 so-called freedom of navigation operations in the year, 3 more than in 2018, during which its vessels sailed within 12 nautical miles of land claimed or occupied by China, according to the South China Sea Strategic Situation Probing Initiative's annual report. American forces also engaged in at least 50 joint and multiple exercises with countries from Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the region, it said. At least 3 US amphibious assault ships and 2 Coast Guard vessels took part in the military exercises, while 8 surveillance ships carried out long-duration missions, it said. The report, which tracks US military activity in the South China Sea, came as tensions continue to rise between Beijing and Washington over issues from trade to technology and, most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. On Saturday, Beijing said that its Air Force and Navy held a joint exercise in the South China Sea on March 10 to simulate face-to-face encounters with invading foreign aircraft and warships. On the same day, the guided missile destroyer USS McCampbell was conducting a freedom of navigation operation near the disputed Paracel Islands. According to the report, of the 3 US aircraft carriers that sailed through the South China Sea last year, the USS John C. Stennis stayed for nearly 3 weeks after a report of call in Thailand in February, while the USS Ronald Reagan engaged in 2 missions, including a high-profile joint exercise in which its strike group sailed through the waters near the disputed Scarborough Shoal. Beijing's expansive claims over the South China Sea have increasingly been challenged by the U.S. and its allies, which regularly conduct freedom of navigation operations through the waters. Beijing has accused the U.S. and other nations of jeopardizing stability in the region. Patrols and overflights near the Paracel and Spratly Island chains and through the Taiwan Strait had become more retaliatory, the report said. As the strategic competition between China and the U.S. has continued to intensify in recent years, the comparison of the navies have become evident, particularly in the South China Sea, it said. By carrying out freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea and sailing through the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. is making a retaliatory response to China, which is becoming a new trend. In an effort to counter China's strategy of using paramilitary and Coast Guard vessels to promote its claims in the disputed waters, the U.S. expanded its deployment of Coast Guard vessels in the region. In April, USCGC Berthold sailed into the South China Sea, while USCGC Stratton joined a training exercise with forces from Southeast Asia in June. The report said the U.S. was expected to continue to diversify its military capacities in the South China Sea, including enhancing the role of Coast Guard vessels and amphibious assault ships, raising the risk of conflicts between the two militaries. As China continues to modernize and strengthen its Navy and Air Force, the U.S. will become more concerned and increase its surveillance against the Chinese military, it said. The Navy, The military service hit hardest by the coronavirus scrambled to contain its first at-sea outbreak, with at least 24 infected aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt, one of 11 active aircraft carriers whose mission is central to the Pentagon's strategy for deterring war with China and Iran. The Roosevelt and its contingent of warplanes may be sidelined for days, sitting pierside in Guam as the entire crew, more than 5,000, is tested. Navy leaders said the carrier could return to duty at any time if required, but the sudden setback is seen as a harbinger of more trouble to come. The Navy is headed into choppy waters in terms of readiness in the months ahead, says retired Admiral James Stavridis, a former ship commander who rose to become NATO's top commander in Europe. In Asia, a carrier presence is central to what the Pentagon has identified as a fundamental shift from fighting insurgent and extremist conflicts in the Middle East to a return to great power competition that means, principally, a bigger focus on China, including its militarization of disputed areas of the South China Sea. The carrier, like other Navy ships, is vulnerable to infectious disease spread given its close quarters. The massive ship is more than 1,000 feet long. Sailors are spread out across a labyrinth of decks linked by steep ladder-like stairs and narrow corridors. Enlisted sailors and officers have separate living quarters, but they routinely grab their food from crowded buffet lines and eat at tables joined end-to-end. Stavridis fears that berthing compartments, or sleeping quarters where a dozen sailors are often packed into spaces not much larger than an average kitchen, will become berthing compartments for the virus. Although the Navy is much smaller than the Army, it accounts for at least 1/3 of all reported COVID-19 cases in the military. None has been reported among Navy's submarine crews, which are widely deployed and include subs armed with long-range nuclear missiles on constant patrol. The U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander, Admiral John Aquilino, said late Thursday that it's not clear how long the Roosevelt will be kept in Guam and that its schedule will be adjusted as needed. He said no infected sailor is a critical health risk, but some have been hospitalized. "We're clearly interested in ensuring that the ship and the crew are healthy," said Aquilino, speaking from his Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, base. "But let there be no doubt the ship's ready to respond if needed." He said worried family members at home should know everything possible is being done for crew safety. Family members of Roosevelt sailors have been reaching out to each other on social media, expressing shock and anxiety. They alternately worried about their family members on the ship and their children at home, sprinkling their posts with questions about local virus testing and memes about toilet paper shortages and pandemic fears. The Roosevelt had been in the South China Sea, and its most recent port visit had been at Vietnam's popular coastal city of Da Nang earlier this month. The carrier was engaged in an exercise with another US warship in the Philippine Sea when it first detected a COVID-19 infection aboard, other officials said. Asked if the outbreak came as a surprise, Aquilino said, "We are operating in the area where the disease started. All the risk and the spread of this disease initiated in this theater. So, if we were surprised, we'd be naive." Aquilino said procedures are in place to try to minimize any spread of the virus, and based on the status of the entire Pacific Fleet, I'm very happy with the commanding officers and the teams for taking this seriously.